You're on mute.
Thank you. So I'll start again. Peace, everyone. Peace, everyone. My name is Erica Keynes. I am co-coordinator. Thank you. So I'll start again. Peace, everyone. Peace, everyone. All right. I am co-coordinator of the Haiti Americas team of the Black Alliance for Peace. I'm very excited to be here this evening to discuss the Zone of Peace and to hear from the brigade that went to Cuba. So I'm going to just go ahead and talk about the Zone of Peace for a bit, for those of you who may not be familiar. So the Black Alliance for Peace, Haiti Americas team launched a collective campaign for the Zone of Peace in our Americas with organizations throughout the region. And we launched from Washington, D.C., Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and Havana, Cuba. The concept of a Zone of Peace emerged from the January 29, 2014 meeting of heads of states and governments of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, known as CELAC. And they declared that Latin America and the Caribbean should be seen and respected as a zone of peace. This declaration from government representatives, however, has not translated into a people-centered movement across the region. So as such, Black Alliance for Peace is leading this effort to activate the popular movement element of the state-centered declaration by instead centering the declaration in a popular call for its implementation and building support across the region. But why did we launch on April 4th? Well, the Black Alliance for Peace was started on April 4th, 2017 as a formation committed to redeveloping the Black radical internationalist position against war, repression, and imperialism, both domestically and abroad. So BAP launched on April 4th as a way to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated on that day in 1968, because BAP is clear on the significance of King well beyond his dream. King's ability to connect the domestic with the international, as evidenced in his speech, Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam, is a type of analysis that Black Alliance for Peace flourishes in. Reinvigorating the Black radical peace tradition, BAP understands peace is not a passive action. To garner peace, we must expose the intricable link between militarism and war, capitalist exploitation, and racist domination. The struggle for a durable peace moves beyond the cessation of war and the elimination of militarism toward the historical fulfillment of equality, justice, and decolonization. So peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the achievement by popular struggle and self-defense of a world liberated from the interlocking issues of global aggression, nuclear armament and proliferation, unjust war and subversion through the defeat of global systems of oppression that include colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. The framework of a people-centered human rights has guided how BAP maneuvers through the rhetorical hypocrisy of the West's use of human rights to continue to blunder the world. A politics of being whole, the people-centered human rights framework is an approach that views human rights as an arena of struggle that, when grounded and informed by the needs and aspirations of the oppressed, becomes part of a unified, comprehensive strategy for anti-colonial, radical social change. So this framework distinguishes itself from the erroneous and prevalent use of quote unquote human rights by requiring an epistemological break with the human rights orthodoxy grounded in Eurocentric liberalism, a reconceptualization of human rights from the standpoint of oppressed groups, a restructuring of prevailing social relationships that penetrate and perpetrate oppression, and the acquiring of power on the part of the oppressed to bring about that restructuring. This framework is why BAP, alongside key partner organizations, understand that lifting up the Zone of Peace as a popular demand that our region be free of externally imposed state violence is even more important today than when it was declared in 2014. The motivations and interests to expand U.S. hegemony across what the U.S. sees as its backyard are tied to the reassertion of the racist Monroe Doctrine, which turned 200 this year. Democracy and human rights are no more than ideological props. So in this 200th year, we are seeing the rebranding of US imperialism by using a wide range of actors and resources, including neocolonial governments and their local and regional structures, aimed at upholding US global power. Combating these imperial efforts means the work must be anti-colonial and anti-imperialist. It must be from the bottom up and not the top down. It must be multilingual, and it must be understood as an effort to make the Americas, Nuestras Americas, our Americas, uniting us all under a common struggle. We all have a stake in what is going on in this region, and we all have a stake in seeing the self-determination and sovereignty of colonized people of the Americas fulfilled. So here are the initial core demands of the Zone of Peace. Dismantle Southcom, shut down the 76 US military bases in the region, end US NATO military exercises, close foreign military bases, installations, and enclaves, as well as withdraw foreign occupation troops, disband US-sponsored state terrorist training facilities like the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, and terminate US as well as foreign training of police forces. Oppose military intervention in Haiti, support the people-centered movement for democracy and self-determination, return Guantanamo to Cuba. The United States must give back the Cuban people and their government the territory it illegally occupies. Sanctions are an act of war, and illegal sanctions and blockades of the regional states, including all economic warfare and lawfare, and recognize their sovereignty. So you can learn more about the Zone of Peace campaign and check out the organizations that have already endorsed at the blackallianceforpeace.com website. And you can go on the Zone of Peace page. We have plenty of information for folks to check out if you want to learn more, interviews, videos, etc. So right now, we're going to dig into the current conditions in Cuba, which most certainly speak to the necessity of the Zone of Peace campaign. The 60-year blockade, in addition to harmful unilateral sanctions brought forward by an erroneous claim of state-sponsored terrorism, in addition to soft power elements backed by institutions like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, in attempts to destabilize this island, is pushing it into another special period. So we will now hear from BAT members who had the honor of visiting Cuba to recognize and celebrate May Day, and they will be discussing their observations, experiences, and what is to be done. So first, we'll watch a brief presentation from Kim Clark, a native of North Charleston, South Carolina, and a member of Low Country Action Committee since the fall of 2022. Thank you.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to share some highlights from the recent brigade. As she said, my name's Kim Clark. I was really excited to go on this trip. It's been a huge highlight for me in my life to be able to have experienced this what was a 2-week political education trip to Cuba. And yeah, this is only a glimpse of some of what we got to do and what we got to see and experience while we were in Cuba. Next slide. Thank you. So from some of the pictures that you'll see, we were a U.S. delegation that was a part of several different international delegations, several folks from all over the world who were in solidarity with Cuba and not only supporting Cuba's efforts and their socialist policy and their government, but also in ending the U.S. blockade against Cuba. And so it was really great to be able to connect with and see all these people who came to support Cuba. Next slide. And here, wherever we went, we had, amazing welcomes. We were really welcomed in when we went to Cuba. This was one of the first of many flowering ceremonies in front of a Jose Marti monument, flowering ceremony right when we came in. Um, I just wanted to share a little bit of a glimpse of that with you all. And this type of demonstration wasn't just the Cubans showing us their welcoming and their wanting to bring us in, but they also would include members of the different delegations oftentimes when they would have these flowering ceremonies. And next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is just me giving a little glimpse of some of the activities we had because it was 2 weeks and we had a very full itinerary. So one of the activities we had was a lecture with Dr. Gladys Hernandez, an economist and researcher at the Centro de Investigación de la Economía Mundial. And we were able to sit in on several different lectures and have several experiences and listen to industry professionals, political leaders, community activists, community members. Thank you, Erica. Um, and even like some of our comrades even got together and we were able to sit and have different discussions and so on. So some were planned, some were a little more impromptu. But just a little self-indulgence on my part, hearing about the economic situation. That was the first lecture we sat in on. That was pretty cool. So just wanted to share some highlights from that lecture. So Dr. Hernandez started the lecture saying that Cuba is affected by multi-systemic issues. So she described rising sea levels that impact their coastal areas, and that new infrastructure and different mitigation measures are needed in those areas, meaning literally that they need to find ways to move people in, actually rebuild towns and move people inward or inland, because the sea levels are rising and they will move inland to where folks are currently living. She did talk about increased fuel costs, even though Cuba does produce its own oil and gas that it uses primarily for electricity. They are having to import quite a bit of um, resources or quite a bit of fuel in order to meet the need as best they can um, with what they need for energy, for driving cars, everything like that. And there's been a 39% increase in the cost of oil, which right now they are in a fuel crisis. Also, Cuba could be producing food products like rice, oil, and milk, but that requires some additional investment, some additional expansion of their agriculture and manufacturing and so on. So they are depending on imports for that. However, that is costing 14% more currently. So there's all these different areas and all these different issues. Right, Shaquille. Yeah, all these different issues that are related to the blockade. And then she also related it to like a climate crisis too, right? The sea levels, the cost of fuel, the energy deficits, these are all being seen worldwide. So for me, this was like an opportunity to get a global education on how the blockade of one country has such a huge effect on multiple countries, especially when you consider, and some of my other comrades, other panelists will share more about the value that Cuba has and is able to demonstrate. So a couple of questions that came up during that lecture, I'm going to stay on this slide for just a little bit longer. A couple other questions that came up just from the crowd asking different things during this lecture that were really enlightening for me, and again brought back to like this global political economy kind of understanding. One was, who does Cuba owe debt to and in what currencies? And Dr. Hernandez, um, she gave a really cool answer. She started with, it is important to know that debt can also be a debt of development, and that countries that acquire credit to develop have certain characteristics. So um, she was saying it's not the same to go into debt as a fascist dictatorship as Cuba went into debt to carry out a socialist process. So her emphasis was, that Cuba is not a dictatorship, but that Cuba has gone into debt, does have credit in socialist countries, started receiving some credits from some non-socialist countries in the 80s. And it's about supporting their industry, their agricultural development, and their social progress, their socialist policy. Some companies and countries and even individuals who believe in Cuba have allowed them to borrow money or help them finance different projects they're working on. And of course, Cuba does believe that they should be paid back. And she ended that answer with saying that Cuba does not belong in the World Bank. And then one last question before I move on to the rest of the presentation. Um, another question that stood out was, what does the prospect of de-dollarization mean for the Cuban economy? Does it increase prospects for investment in Cuba? And that, again, gave me a different insight on global, political economy, because I hadn't even thought about de-dollarization or what that would mean. And that question was focused on the US dollar. So she emphasized that Cuba does have lots of relationships with other countries. And some of these other countries also, like China or Russia, prefer not necessarily to need the US dollar anymore. And she stated that 60% of transactions in the US dollar are with what we're at now, but 10 years ago it was 78%. So there is a decrease happening. But the imposing of the US dollar on other countries creates isolation within the economy. It limits different countries' ability to interact with them. Like in Cuba's case, they're not allowed to receive the US dollar. So um, there are, once again, other countries that are looking at other options in different ways. She did mention BRICS and just some other movements where countries are looking at that, and that is an opportunity for Cuba to receive extra investment. Additional investment would help to address some of the issues that I highlighted, as well as several others that she brought to light. All right, you can go to the next slide. So I do have just a few pictures from our visit to the Centro Fidel Castro Ruse. And as we're looking at a couple of these slides, I just wanted to highlight for me that Cuba demonstrated a high level of diplomacy by the way that they treated us, welcomed us in, celebrated with us, and shared as much as they could with us, despite the limitations of the blockade. Cuban diplomacy reflects the system of socialism practiced in society and in the government. Diplomacy means that Cuba wants to consider how to take care of and protect its people while while also thinking about how to take care of and protect people outside of Cuba. There is an understanding that there would be a mutual exchange. And this lends to the issues between Cuba and the US. The people of Cuba and their political leaders understand their value. If they're going to negotiate with other countries like the US, they understand that they don't have to agree to all of the terms, especially if it could be capitalist or exploitative. And so the US, of course, is used to getting its way, or bullying, intimidating, or outright exploiting other countries to get their way. Since the US is driven by capitalism, capitalism is basically the US policy. However, like through the various lectures we heard from the different aspects of Cuban society, I better understand now socialism as a policy that socialism is a real way to structure government, not a facade or a cute aspiration as propaganda would have us believe. Next slide, please. And this is just showing the entryway into the Centro de Fidel Castro Ruz. Next slide. And these are just some of the exhibits and so on that they had. Next slide, please. So this next set of slides reflect my favorite part of the trip when we got to visit Isirca, which is a sugar refinery and collection of like sugar cane farms. We got to meet with them, meet with their workers. Cuba, of course, is extremely labor union friendly, so the workers got to speak from the standpoint of being a part of the labor union. Next slide. We got to hear about like just some of the different benefits that they have in their union, the way that certain things that can happen just in life aren't penalized. I mean, it sounded really amazing. Healthcare is free in Cuba. So there's just a lot of really cool things that they had that they were able to do for their workers. One of the cañeros, the sugarcane workers, he had a really good explanation about his work. He lives and works in Cuba, but was from the Dominican Republic and had been a sugarcane worker out there as well. And he gave us a comparison, and he talked about how the temperature, it gets really hot. They're much closer to the equator, so it gets really hot outside. And in the Dominican Republic, you can't stop. You have to keep working. However, in Cuba, they have a thermometer and they're watching the temperature. And if it gets too hot, they get to go over into the shade, drink some water, let things cool off, and then they can continue working. And that seems simple, if you will, but like even in the States, that sounds like unheard of, like not something that would be okay. That you wouldn't be penalized for if you tried to just take a break. So that was pretty interesting to hear. It was also pretty cool to explore their facility. They had everything from like labs to actual like their factory equipment in the refinery, and everything. You can go to the next slide. And so yeah, this is a couple of pictures. One in the lab area, and then the other where we were having discussion with them in the factory. And this represents another limitation of the blockade. So things as simple as being able to fix things, just get access to parts, are limited by the blockade. So this was a part of their refinery that was shut down, that is not operable until further notice, until they're able to find some way to fix this area, because there's just some part that they need and they can't get access to it. Next slide, please. We also got to demonstrate with the workers. There were several opportunities to participate in demonstrations. Of course, we participated.
Get me back.
Yeah, I'm here. Next slide. So this was my favorite part. A part of the labor union contract that the workers have with the company was also that they have beach pavilions in every province where there are workers. So after we had the presentations and toured the facility, they drove us out to have lunch with them at their beach pavilion. So that was amazing to me. And I now feel like all of the U.S. unions are doing it wrong, because I don't think anybody has like beach pavilions, and it's for all workers. It's not for certain workers, the executives only or anything like that. This is for all of their workers. You're doing it completely wrong. And then the last thing we did, and this is the last thing I'll talk about a little bit, is then we went into a neighborhood, and we got to go into this is like one of their community centers, and this is actually where they had childcare. They had childcare available for everybody in this particular neighborhood. All the children, parents could drop them off on their way to work. Everybody had access to childcare, free or low cost childcare. And as you can see in the background, you can see like the neighborhood folks and everything. Next slide. And the reason for that was because then we had a whole block party with the neighborhood, with the folks. So they had some young people out there dancing and celebrating with us. And there were several other presentations, but I'll just leave y'all with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. That was a great presentation, and I always love to hear when people leave this country and see that it could be better. We can have better. People are doing much better significantly, and just to bring that back home and organize around that. So that was great. I did enjoy the pictures because I didn't get to do a lot of those things while I was there. So it was really interesting to see. Next, we'll be hearing from Damian Scott, who I miss so much. Baltimore misses Damian. But Damian is a graduate student studying Africana Studies at Georgia State University, and he is also a member currently of Black Alliance for Peace Atlanta chapter. So, Damian, if you want to share your experience.
Yeah. Thank you, Erica. And thanks for everybody for showing up and hearing what we all had to say. It's much appreciated. Can you hear me? Y'all can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yep.
All right, cool. Great. Thank you. So that was a great job by Kim. A lot of what I was going to talk about, she mentioned beforehand. If you notice the things that she was bringing up, from the labor unions to the sugar plantation, these were all institutions. And while we were in Cuba, I mean, it was just so different, because I know that there's people in this chat right now. We all come from different backgrounds. Like, this is open meeting. Maybe you may not even be in back. So I can't say for sure, but maybe you might have thought about what it would be like to have a revolution in America. Maybe not, but it's a big difference from how it is for me in America, where I study and read with the hopes that maybe something would happen, that a change would happen, that a more progressive socialist cause would be fought for in America. Then to go to a nation where it happened. It happened. They fought and they won. And the differences that I started to realize, it wasn't just a language difference, a cultural difference. It wasn't just, we were only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. We're still very much in the Americas. The difference was an institutional difference, and that the blockade is meant to strangle the people by strangling which institutions they can build. In the field of sociology, it's a big debate on if institutions were built to be privatized, or if the origins of institutions were privatized, or if they were social. We don't have to get into that debate, but you just have to know you live in a country that has thoroughly said that its most important institutions are the privatized ones. And when you go to America, those are the ones that are most funded, most represented in the media, so they're always in front of you, and where you get your jobs. And you live in a country that outwardly casts doubt and fear on solutions based upon the state, because it is a capital state, which means it's actually ran by its capitalist institutions. Now you go to a place in Cuba where it is fully committed to socialism, and I saw some stark differences within this institution. So what am I talking about? So I'm talking about what Kim mentioned earlier, the I don't want to say the Al-Qaeda, I don't know how to say it in there, but translated to English, it stands for the Cuban Institute for Research on Sugarcane Derivatives. And it was actually started by Che Guevara, who was also an icon in the left, and you might be known for him, shooting it out with Batista in the jungle. Like, that might be the more sexy story. But when that was all over, you got to figure out how you're going to help and care for these people under this illegal and torturous blockade. And what that sugarcane plantation did, they were working on a lot of medicinal things. Anything that they can get out of it, they were going to extract. They were going to get it. And the biggest difference is that your labor isn't exploited in order to benefit a wealthy few. It's whatever you produce will get shared amongst the community. That's the only way they can build these institutions in Cuba. It's the only way they can do it, because the blockade is meant to cause division amongst the Cubans, and it's meant to get them fighting amongst one another. So however many years we're decades after that revolution. It's literally set up to get the younger generation to start to question those values of socialism, those values of collective humanity, and to start to wonder, like, if this capitalism thing is the real way. We saw it in downtown Havana. Some of the younger people we ran into were really questioning. So your institutions have to be able to enforce that. You have to make each generation believe in what you are doing. And you have to get them to understand, look, I'll say it again, we're only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, but it was incredible to me how even from where we were, how penetrative the American media is. I could just feel it. You can see it. You can see the videos in the hotel and the news that were going, and some of the people that we mentioned in Havana. And the American media, especially mainstream, will never give a fair share to Cuba. So not only are you young and you're growing up under these harsh conditions in the blockade, but there's a constant Western media barrage of a Cuban dictatorship, of like a bunch of things. And if it's not institutional, if the care that you have is institutional, the people won't be able to push through these things. There would be no Cuba. There would be no Cuba if they weren't really committed to the socialist principles in which they espouse. It just wouldn't. They wouldn't be here anymore. It would have been the done deal. That's how horrid that blockade is on these people. And you also can see it in their college universities. I'm a graduate student right now, so it was kind of surreal to hear how much the unions were involved in their university process. Where I'm here in neoliberal bourgeoisie Atlanta, and the graduate students here are trying to unionize, and it's hard to get people to sign up for that. But they have it literally embedded within their university system. That is institutional. And when they told us that once you graduate, they're not looking for your marks. They're not looking for what you did in the classroom as far as awards go. When you're awarded by what you do in the community. And if you've ever been to the colonial university system in America, it's the exact opposite almost. It's what you do for these institutions. It's not what you do for the people outside of them. I know this firsthand. Unless your politics match with the university, you're not going to get recognized. And if you step outside of those parameters of capitalism, those parameters of a colonial education, you get outwardly ostracized and punished. And I also seen it. How am I on time? I started a timer and it's been like 8 minutes. Should I be wrapping up right now?
You good.
Okay, cool. And I also seen it with their legislative system, which changed their what am I thinking of? Let me go back to my notes. I'm sorry. Their legislative system, which changed their constitution. Sorry, I'm blank. As recently as 2019, when they implemented that family code and said that no matter what your family looks like, you're guaranteed a set of basic human rights. That in itself is institutional. So it was saying all of these things. It was saying what that blockade is meant to do, because you have a romanticized vision of revolution, but I seen a nation that is engaged in a protracted struggle to constantly espouse these values and constantly put them in the next generation. So that's really all I have to say. Thank you all for coming again, and I greatly enjoyed my time. And I want to say I appreciate BAP as an organization for the politics and the line that we stand. And also, I got to shout out Erica, who is my sensei. So thank you.
Not sensei. Nah, I'm so very proud of Damien. That was an excellent presentation. I've known Damien since he came into BAP, so this is a proud moment for me to see how much he has evolved as an organizer, a committed one. So next we are going to move right along and hear from Gus Griffin, who I have the honor of being a member alongside of him in Eugene People's Progress Party here in Maryland, which is a Black-led workers' political party. We're trying to get on the ballot, y'all. The only Black working class focused political party in Maryland. So it's a big deal. He's also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace on the Africa team, and is an occasional contributor to the Black Agenda Report. So I'm looking forward to what Gus has to say.
Thank you, Erica. Well done, Kim. Well done, Damien. I think there's been a great deal of focus, deservedly so, on the impact of the embargo on Cubans. It's been devastating to Cubans. And so again, justifiably so. I don't think that there's enough focus on the impact outside of Cuba and worldwide. And in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact it's had on people in the United States. So just a few things. First, we'll start with in the US, according to the CDC, there is a growing diabetes epidemic crisis. In fact, 13% of adults have diabetes. That's about 34 million. 35% of adults have prediabetes. That's about 88 million. And 85% of those don't even know that they have it. So meanwhile, in Cuba, they've developed a treatment for diabetes that is very effective. They've even developed a cure for diabetic ulcers, which lead to amputations and things of that nature. And so we see clearly that if US citizens had access to the medications that Cuba has, fewer US people would be dying, fewer US people would have amputations. It's very clear, if not for the blockade. When we go to COVID-19 vaccine, as we know, the US led the world by far in COVID-19 deaths. Yet Cuba, simultaneously, in spite of not having clear access to syringes, Cuba developed 5 different COVID-19 vaccines, 5 different vaccines. And so it's clear from that could have saved US lives as well. We talk about the Latin American School of Medicine, also known as ELAM. It was established in 1999. It provides a tuition-free medical education for any students that qualify. Tuition-free medical education for any students that qualify. Currently, there are about 220 practicing physicians in the United States who came through the Latin American School of Medicine. And I'm actually in education. I work at the community college, Montgomery College, and one of the alum from this program is an alumni of Montgomery College, and we're actually trying to work on getting her to come to the college in the fall to talk to students about the program. In talking to students over the years, I can't tell you how many students who have aspirations to be doctors, but they default the aspirations to maybe physician assistant or something that costs less simply because they don't have the money. They just don't have the money and they don't see any way forward. In fact, the average medical school student has about $250,000 of student debt. About 74% of medical students have some kind of student debt of some kind. So clearly, if they knew about this, they would have a little more hope. And when I do tell them about this, you should see the looks on their faces. Just you can see hope growing in their eyes. Their dreams are all of a sudden within reach. And so that's what we want to continue to promote. The last thing I want to talk about was Katrina. As you may know, that there was about 1,400 people who died from Katrina. That's probably a low level estimate. During that time, Fidel Castro offered to send 1,600 doctors, medical professionals to Louisiana to help with the recovery, to help with those in need. And as you probably know, the United States denied it, be it ego, be it politics, for whatever reason. The bottom line is people died because they turned down the Cuban help. And it isn't as if that was something unique. Cuba has been doing that all over the world for many, many years. In fact, that same year, they sent their medical humanitarian efforts to Kashmir, where there was a devastating earthquake. And to this day, most of the people who were affected were Pakistani. And to this day, they sing the praises of Cuba for the efforts that it did to aid them in a time of need. So this list is by no means complete. The country can and is doing more, and the people of the U.S. and the rest of the world would benefit greatly if the embargo, a relic of the Cold War, were ended. In this, as mentioned earlier, 200th year of the infamous Monroe Doctrine, from which the U.S. declared all the Western Hemisphere under its hegemonic domain, there is no better time to renounce this ideology, which is at the root of the Cuban embargo. The Washington, D.C. Council is among the latest to take this step in this direction recently by passing a resolution urging the lifting of the embargo and removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. A third action would be to return the Guantanamo Bay back to the island as a piece of its sovereign land. This sentiment represents a growing international movement of 193 nations last year. 185 voted to condemn the blockade last year. This trend has been consistent for about 30 years. So the bottom line is this benefits no one, it hurts everyone, and it's well beyond time to end this embargo, which never was justified in the first place. And so we thank you for joining us, and we urge you to join us at the Black Alliance for Peace in helping us to end this embargo sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gus. I actually learned something as well. I was not aware of how much Cuba has done to that effect. So thank you for your report back. So last but certainly not least, and I'm gonna say this right, we have a special report from Shaquille Fontenot, who is an anti-imperialist communications strategist, educator, and cultural worker. Shaquille currently serves the National Network on Cuba as a co-chair and is the chief strategy officer at Cedar Wolf Media Group. She is the co-founder of Low Country Action Committee, ALAC, a Black-led grassroots organization dedicated to Black liberation through service, political education, and collective action in the Low Country of South Carolina. The Low Country Action Committee is also a member of the National Network on Cuba, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, the Black Alliance for Peace, Charleston Climate Coalition, and several other groups. So go ahead, Shaquille.
Thank you, Erica. Hey, everybody. As Erica mentioned, I am Shaquille. I'm going to try to be quick with this presentation so we can get to your questions, but I've been tasked with discussing false U.S. narratives about Cuba and the anti-Blackness question. So I I really want to highlight the importance of challenging misconceptions about our comrades to foster better understanding, and also make deeper connections so we can become better internationalists and strengthen our own goals as it pertains not only to advancing the zone of peace, but also specifically advocating against capitalism and imperialism. So let's get right into it. These are some common U.S. narratives that we see directed against Cuba, and this was actually a focus topic of one of our sessions while we were on the May Day Brigade. And I've been to Cuba several times, so I'm going to skip some of the specific things that we did on the brigade. I'm going to focus more on this particular narrative, but if you are interested in learning more about our past brigade experience, please just visit our website or our social media accounts. But here you see the most recent one. There's a Chinese spy base on Cuba. Cuban government clamping down on religion, detainees because they're doing anti-government protests. So these are narratives that the U.S. continues to push as part of their efforts to delegitimize the revolutionary project in Cuba. So we see this happening with songs that are winning Grammys, artists being paid to cry out about Cuba being a repressive regime. And it's the same kind of pattern of foolishness that we're seeing that's being used in anti-China propaganda, anti-DPRK propaganda, and it's all funded by the US government. So I have on the screen here some of the lies the US tells. Cuba's a violator of human rights. Cuba's a failed state, no artistic or religious freedom, a lack of democracy. And underneath each one of them, you can read kind of the counter narrative to that. And we have evidence for that, as you have seen, based on what my comrades have shared about their own May Day experiences. So the main one, well, actually, let me just highlight that these narratives are coming from the same place that limits access to everything that we need, whether that's healthcare, gender affirming care, voting access. We're seeing abusive protesters, and we are in the belly of the beast right now, one of the biggest state sponsors of terror worldwide and domestically. So I just want to point that out, that we have to be really mindful and vigilant when we see these things that are happening, these narratives that are coming out, because they're coming from somewhere that obviously wants to destabilize sovereign nations. So another thing that I want to really unpack today is the false narrative that Cuba is anti-Black. So again, this is just an extension of the U.S. continued attempts to bring about regime change in Cuba. And we see this happening on social media networks, in capitalist-funded media areas. We saw this during the SOS Cuba hashtags that were happening during the July 11th protests, and other harmful narratives from the United States. So the U.S. terrorist war against Cuba was conceived as a state policy, but as you can see on the screen, there are so many different areas, so many different forms of sabotage and manipulation to undermine the Cuban revolutionary process. So as we think about and talk about the race question, it's important to be rooted in historical context. So of course, Cuba was a colony from 1492 to 1898, and Cubans fought 3 wars of independence from Spanish rule. So when we think about the race question, we have to think about the nexus of racial and national identity. So how are Afro-Cubans reconciling their identity within a national Cuban context? So I just wanted to quickly highlight those 3 wars of liberation. And this is in the midst of the abolition of slavery in Cuba. So when we speak about Afro-Cuban resistance, there's a legacy of that from the resisting of Spanish colonialism to the resisting of the Batista dictatorship, the 26th of July movement. So an image here is of Carlotta, one of the leaders of a slave rebellion in Matanzas. So this is one of many Afro-Cuban revolutionaries that were desired to bring about an end of racial discrimination, slavery, and achieve political and social equality in Cuba. So one thing that I really need to point out is that there are enshrined rights in the Constitution for Afro-Cubans. So the Cuban Constitution of 1901 recognized citizenship for rights for all individuals born in Cuba, but it wasn't until May 20th, 1902, when Cuba gained formal independence, that these rights were extended. So in 1940 and 1959, we saw the expansion of these civil rights, which really uplifted the principles of racial equality and the elimination of racial discrimination and segregation from a legal standpoint. So it was technically not possible to replicate the Jim Crow laws that we were seeing in the United States during those times, because there was a different social reality and landscape in Cuba. I also would be remiss if I didn't point out Cuba's support for Angola. So remember, the question is Cuba anti-Black? This is part of those narratives that we're unpacking. Cuba played a significant role in the Angolan War of Independence, and you can see some imagery here, but this was all part of a broader struggle for independence as part of the larger anti-colonial movement and the belief that Cuba has in the right of peoples to self-determination. So what's going on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Cuba as it relates to race relations? These radical revolutionary policies aimed at destroying the structure of colonialism benefit Afro-Cubans as well. But this societal transformation also allowed a space for avoiding institutional and cultural advances towards equity or equality in treatment. So again, remember I said earlier, these rights are legally enshrined, but we still have social issues that are happening. So prior to the revolution, there's fewer access to jobs, limited public access to spaces, cultural spaces, entertainment, subject to stereotypes, and really a hierarchical kind of positioning. And then after the revolution, we see agrarian reform, the success of the literacy campaign, education nationalization, and then other access to housing, increased life expectancies, lower death rate of babies, and Black Cubans on paper and systemically in the legal system are accepted. So as with any social project, contradictions do arise over time. So the cultural system, the symbiotic and ideological system of inferiority of Black people in Cuba were working in contrast with the tenets of the Cuban Constitution. So again, legally it was enshrined, but societally, no. And so a lot of the notes and a lot of my knowledge about Afro-Cuban history comes from some of my more advanced comrades who are doing this in their daily lives. And one of them is Professor Zuleika Guerra. And I want to highlight this quote. She said, "You can't assume that racism will end because of the transition of the social structure of property, proclaimed socialist vocation, and high levels of state ownership of the means of production. Racism in Cuba hid in the attic, crawled under the carpet, and it moved to the darkest place of the house and waited for its chance." So when was its chance to really be pointed out and looked at as a major issue that needs to be highlighted? Around the fall of the dissolution of the USSR, capitalism took over and Cuba, excuse the typo, didn't have the resources necessary to face a significant drop in what they were able to bring into in the country. So this is the period where we're entering the special period. And when that happens, despite all that, health, social security, culture, and education still persisted and were guaranteed. So when we think about the structure of capitalism, the material conditions will affect cultural and political development. So just as we're seeing the fall of the SSR, all around people are not having access to resources and they're not having access to the systems that they need because of the structure of US government, really. But I say all that to say that certain groups, and particularly Afro-Cubans in certain cases, were more subject to the harms of this lack of global connection, this lack of ability to just navigate through society because of capitalism. So we did have, hold on, y'all, my dog is barking. So at the end of the 1990s, we see a struggle against racism and discrimination. And this was a policies that were looked at and led by Fidel. But you had to consider other things too, including the continuation of the US economic blockade, the legacies of colonialism, which these are what we refer to as the superstructural issues in culture and educational systems that allow kind of racism to run rampant, but not as a systemic problem in social governments and policies. So we see the emergence of differing societal views as it relates to race in Cuba. And also we have to think about how the designation as a state sponsor of terror also loops into all of this that we're discovering. So I wanted to highlight the importance of grassroots movements in Cuba as it relates to pushing forward the agenda for really fostering sovereignty on a different level. So we see in Cuba a revolution within a revolution where there's social debate, social work happening, community projects happening. And we got to meet some of the leaders of the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente in Cuba, who are working to alleviate a lot of these concerns, create financial independence, and also have conversations and diagnosis at the state and municipal level all across the island to address the race question. So this is when we get into this is sufficiency of the state versus activism. So yes, the needs of people are consistently met. They're housed, they have free healthcare, they have possibilities of the revolution, but we still have to consider, okay, what were their conditions prior to the revolution? How are they connected to the overall growth and transformation of Cuban society? And then looking at the state position versus the grassroots position, because as I mentioned, legally these rights are enshrined, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have somebody like looking over your shoulder when you are at a grocery store or something because of the conditions that exist. This getting this dog. So in addition to grassroots efforts to address the race question, hold on y'all, let me get this dog real quick. Sorry about that. So in addition to individual efforts to alleviate the racial issue and to discuss it, there are also initial programs established by the Cuban government. So we see the National Program and Commission Against Racism and Discrimination established in 2019, led by President Miguel Diaz-Canel. And we see new activism emerging in study centers, lab collectives, among artist organizations, and more interest in the academy about studying this question as well. And then we see long-term projects from different unionized organizations really getting into that question. So again, when we think about the narrative that Cuba is anti-Black, we have to think about how capitalism and material conditions affect race relations overall, and this history and legacy of white supremacy. Because on the island, often in the census, Black people didn't even equate themselves with white people, and these are leftover remnants of a colonial structure. And then also, a lot of Afro-Cubans that I've spoken with are really exploring a generational gap. So we have the older folks that are grateful for the revolutionary process. These are the people that might have gone up to a fourth grade education, and then after the revolution, as an adult, they were able to learn how to read and get to higher levels of education, versus those that were emerging after the education, after the revolution, and having these already ingrained, enshrined rights that are narrating their perspective about the revolutionary process. So going back to those superstructural issues, we have to consider that racism is part of the way that capitalism is structured. And it's insidious because its origins demanded a specific labor force and the establishment of a specific hierarchy that led to the conditions that we see today. So I believe that the Cuban people will decide how the race issue is handled, much like they have full capability to decide how they want to structure the future of their society. And it's our job to support them and other African people around the world to take full control of their lives and to counter the propaganda that we see here and the global interference that we're seeing come from the United States. So part of the way that NNOC is doing that is helping to take Cuba off the list of state sponsors of terror. So the state sponsor of terrorism list doesn't allow Cuba to have effective exchange with other countries. It doesn't allow Cuba to be able to have remittances go back and forth between families. It restricts a lot of the same things that the embargo restricts, but it's an added layer in that there are fewer ways to navigate around it. And there is legislation that is being proposed, HR 314, that is going to prevent the removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terror. And so I wanted to highlight these two things, but also highlight the fact that this work is part of making our Americas a zone of peace. So if you're passing a resolution in your local area, if you're getting involved in our upcoming actions, our off the list actions, which include a social media storm, as well as various events throughout next week and next weekend, these are all ways that we can foster a greater understanding about, what is really going on in Cuba, but also foster that international collaboration that Gus was mentioning earlier, that my other comrades were mentioning earlier. So part of the plan of US propaganda is to distract from the success of the revolution and point out weak points caused by the United States. But the achievements of the revolution and the societal growth and constant transformation must be communicated so that the people are aware of what's possible in the future. I think that a liberated Cuba will lead to liberation for us all. And I believe that it is our duty to really reflect on these things and dive deeper and do our research and get a true perspective and not just listen to what comes out in the Wall Street Journal. So that's it for me. Sorry about my dog, y'all.
Not sure if they was making noise for Cuba. I felt them. I was just excited. That was a great presentation. Cuba's an anti-Black nation is one of my pet peeves, especially before traveling there. So I'm glad that I got to go there. I got to be engaged with the Red Barriel Afro-Descendants and really get that understanding and perspective that they are organized in such a way that they can confront these contradictions of social racism and also smash them. So I think that's very important. And then also, if folks, I just want to do this quick plug. Salifu Mack, who is in the chat, they're on right now. They have an incredible piece called Anti-Blackness in the Clouds that really discusses the ways that anti-Blackness is discussed here and the actual material reality of it in Cuba and how they're actually working through that. And that's on Hood Communists. So go on Hood Communist blog, another plug. But if folks have questions for the panelists that was not covered, please do put them in the chat. I don't know if anybody else had something that they want to add from their presentation that they did not get a chance to.
I'd just like to add that a great book to read on Cuba is of course by the great Gerald Horne, Race to Revolution, and it talks about what led up to the Cuban Revolution and what was unique about Cuba, and of course you can't go wrong with Dr. Horne. So that would be a primary read that I would recommend for folks trying to figure out how Cuba got to where it's at today. And
I see a question in the chat from Dr. Lee, and anyone could take it. Why are some Hispanics in Florida so anti-Cuban? And I think that might speak to a little bit of what we talked about, but if anyone wants to go into that history. Okay, so I will maybe start and someone can pick up. Especially from that book that was just mentioned by Gerald Horne, it really goes on to the historical conditions of Cuba that led to the revolution. But as part of the revolution, a lot of people were exiled and had to go. And those families that were exiled were in opposition of the revolution. So in simple terms, I know a lot of people like to just simply say that they're just mad because they can't go back into Cuba. But being in Cuba and actually seeing how African Cuba is, it is, in my opinion, that's really why they're mad. That Cuba is a very, very African nation that they no longer have a say in, that they no longer have control in, and they really are pushing to get it back, which is why they are now taking these sort of these initiatives to pierce through that Blackness and that Africanness of Cuba and sort of inject themselves in the rhetoric and the narrative of anti-Blackness to cause some destabilization. But yeah, they really want the island back. If we know the history of Cuba before the revolution, it was a very profitable island. It was like a playground, you know, for the rich. And they would like to see that back. So I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to add to that, because I probably gave a simple explanation, but I do recommend reading, just as Gus did, Dr. Horn's book, because it does flesh out that history.
I would just add one more thing. X percentage of the descendants in Southern Florida are descendants of the Cubans in Southern Florida. They're descendants of those who lost in the Bay of Pigs. And they got an attitude. I mean, you know, not to oversimplify it, but, you know, they have never gotten over that. And any way they can vent out, they vent out. And there's a certain degree of white privilege, of course, that goes along with this. And they're just never going to forget that. And that's the way it is.
Okay, we have another question. In what way can those of us who either have gone or want to go to Cuba can better coordinate and organize with one another across geographic and political gaps? And then they go on to say, is anyone here able to speak to the ongoing peace talks between the state and resistant groups in Colombia happening in and with Cuba's help? So that's 2 questions. How can we coordinate better with one another? And then does anyone have anything they could offer about the ongoing peace talks?
I can speak to the first part. So I know that I want to say that BAP is an NNOC member. So at the National Network on Cuba, even if you're not a member, you have access to all of our Cuba related campaigns and can connect with our membership as well. So if you want to go to Cuba, I would encourage you to go on a brigade, and you can find information about that on our website. Particularly, we host the International May Day Brigade on the US side. If you want to coordinate with other Cuba support and solidarity groups in your area, I'll drop an email in the chat so you can reach out. We'll try to connect you with someone. And in terms of bridging those political gaps, I think that we just need to continue to foster moments like this and to continue to push forward our political education initiatives and have this cross collaboration, because it is an international issue. It is something that affects all of us. And I think it's very important for us to be intentional about that coordination process.
And I don't know if anyone had anything they were able to speak to the ongoing peace talks between the state and resistant groups in Colombia happening and with Cuba's help. Okay. Well, I think in terms of the peace talks, I would like to sort of reestablish the whole idea of the zone of peace. I think that this aligns with it. I think what Colombia is doing with the peace talks, not just with Cuba, but I know that Venezuela is involved. I know Mexico is also involved. I think that really speaks to the efforts for the region, for the Americas, to one, sort of detach itself from the strongholds of U.S. hegemony that's strangling it. Again, we noted earlier that this is the 200th year of the Monroe Doctrine, but then also with these ongoing relationships, establish some sovereignty and self-determination in the region, which I think is very much needed. It is something that I want to keep an eye out because there's a lot of happening in Colombia, a lot of moving parts, and we know that Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela primarily have been, very supportive of the new left-wing government. There's been connections being made, but with Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela being sort of the triple axis of threat for the U.S., that might mean something entirely different for the process that Colombia is trying to move forward with. So that's as much as I can add to it. I think that question just sort of reestablishes the necessity for us to push forward the campaign of a zone of peace, and what it means for the Americas. Yeah. And I believe that might have been our last question. I do not see any more questions in the chat. So I do want to offer, oh, I don't, yeah, on the Q&A either. Oh wait, one more. How is Cuba involved in the current developing situation in Haiti with the core group and the impending happening occupation? So I'll take that question too. Most recently, at the top of the year, CLAC got together, which is the Caribbean and Latin American nations of states that represent CLAC, and Cuba is a part of that. CLAC got together for at the top of the year to coordinate a declaration and what they want to do moving forward. Unfortunately, CLAC took a very reactionary position in terms of Haiti, and this would be the heads of states of CLAC. As so much as so that they recognize Ariel Henry, who is illegitimate, as someone that they would take heed and follow behind, not wanting to make any decisions for Haiti, but wanting to support whatever decisions are made for Haiti. The problem is that the decisions being made for Haiti are not coming from Haitians. They're not coming from a leader who has been voted in. He's been supported by the core group. Now, we know Cuba is in opposition of institutions like the core group, so is Nicaragua, so is Venezuela, but CLAC as a whole has taken a sort of reactionary position. But they have sort of grassroots groups that, those are the groups that we would like to join us in the Zone of Peace campaign. But groups like CLAC Social, who has made statements against CLAC's position, in totality, in support of Haiti. So I can try to find that link from CLAC Social if folks are interested in reading that and seeing what they have to say. But the Cuban people, they are in much support of Haiti. I think Cuba and Haiti have an intrinsic, very sort of common history in a sense. They have a connecting history, and they have a connecting contemporary situation. It's just that there's a lot of politics in the Americas that needs to be sorted out. And I think that the Zone of Peace being lifted as a people-centered campaign will help us sort through those things, or at least activate the call for the heads of states to do better.
That's right, Erica. Them thorough answers.
Thank you. So I think that was it for questions. So I do want to leave some space for the panelists for any final words that they may have, or any final thoughts. I think everyone gave such a fantastic presentation. I was actually really blown away. There was things that I would like to think that I knew, that I was able to learn from this presentation. So I want to give you guys the final say, and you can go off, take yourself off mute as you speak.
I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for everyone who organized this. Thank you to all the participants. And my final thought is, we all know a tactic of imperialism is to water down the reality of the experience of the people, domestically and abroad. So we just need to bring everything we learned back to our own collective struggles and be conscious of the fact that the systems of the imperialist empire are extremely ineffective and reactive. So now, because they have their hands in so many different things, it's time for us to really strengthen one another and fight back. So that's my final word.
I would just add, if you haven't been to Cuba, go to Cuba, please. Join us in our effort to end the blockade. This is a small island that has stared imperialism in the face, in the eye, without blinking for over 60 years. And they're still there. And they believe in their revolution. I believe in their revolution. I hope we all here listening believe in their revolution, and they deserve our support.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for coming, and kind of second what Mr. Gus just said. The revolution in Cuba does matter, and it might seem like and what's going on in the Americas does matter, and the Zone of Peace campaign from BAP, and also the actions by the NNOC are great things to get involved with, and these things do matter on not just how we look at the world internationally, but what we want to see in our communities as well. It's all connected. Nothing's just a single issue, as Erica says. So thank you all.
And I'll reiterate mainly what my fellow panelists and everyone said. Thank you all so much who were able to make it. Thank you all, whoever's able to catch the rewatch and everything. Thank you all so much for supporting us, being able to share our thoughts about, our biggest takeaways and our support for Cuba. Thank you so much.
And again, I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the tech in the background for keeping it running smooth. I want to thank Angela for being able to keep the questions and the links moving in the chat for folks to get the information. Again, if you have questions or you want to learn more about the Zone of Peace campaign that was launched on April 4th, you can by going to blackallianceforpeace.com. As soon as you get on the website, you'll see a big banner for Zone of Peace. You can click right on it. It'll take you right to the page where we have a list and a host of information. This webinar will probably be on it soon. So tell a friend to be able to check it out. And again, I do want to reiterate, we're going to make our Americas a zone of peace because this is our America. So we have as much stake as what's happening in Cuba as we do as what's happening in Atlanta, as we do what's happening in Baltimore, as we do as what's happening in Peru, as we do what's happening in Haiti. This belongs to us. And we have the responsibility as anti-imperialists, as Pan-Africanists, as people who are wanting a better world, to ensure that we make our Americas a zone of peace. So thank you all for attending this evening. This was a fantastic presentation. I'm very proud of my comrades, some of who this is their first time ever doing this, and I think they knocked it out the park. Yeah, so no compromise, no retreat. Thank you all.